This week seems to have marked a turning point in relations between Russia and the West, with the passage of much stricter sanctions aimed at Russian banks and Russian companies, both by the European Union and by the United States. In fact, the Financial Times wrote an editorial this week saying this was the end of a 25-year period in Western-Russian relations. Well, with me is my colleague Quentin Peel, who's observed that 25-year period in various postings as a foreign correspondent in Moscow, in Berlin, in Brussels. Quentin, do you think that that really is such a dramatic moment that we've reached?
Well, I think it's a very difficult moment. These sanctions are tougher, I think, than most people expected. After all, the European Union had been criticised for weeks for not getting its act together, not doing anything. First about Mr. Putin moving in and effectively annexing the Crimea, and then about providing arms to the Russian separatists in eastern Ukraine. So actually there'd been a lot of criticism about Europe in particular not doing enough. Well, they finally got their act together. Now, the question is, could this be very counterproductive? Could it actually drive the Russians even more into their nationalist camp?
Well, we'll get on to that in a second, because I have some concerns about that, I must admit. But just give us an idea of the scope of it, because as you say, most of the commentary has been, oh, Europe's being a bit feeble, and then suddenly you get this package which hits the biggest Russian banks and so on. Where did it come from, and how far-reaching do you think it actually is?
Well, interestingly, I think there are German fingerprints on this package all over it, and this had been building up for a time. Angela Merkel has been very tough on this issue, much tougher than she's been given credit for, I think, in America and in Britain, because ever since Crimea happened, she said something has got to be done, but it's going to be very difficult. One, we've got to try and get Mr. Putin back online, failed. Two, I've got to try and persuade German business, very heavily exposed to Russia, that actually they're going to feel the pain. And three, I've got to get my European partners on board. So all of those things still had to be done. But nonetheless, I think she was determined to lay down the line. And this is going to make it very difficult for Russian banks in particular to pay their debts over the next couple of years. It's going to stop future arms sales, and it's also going to cut off technology from the oil and gas sector in Russia.
Okay, well, it's very tough, and for those who feel very strongly about the downing of the airline, Crimea and all that, it's very satisfying to see this finally happen. And yet, there must be some doubts about, well, what's the end game? What are we actually hoping to achieve? And just to put that case, I mean, I would say, if you look at the stakes for Putin personally and for Russia, there must be considerable doubts as to whether this will actually change their behavior. I mean, can Putin afford to back down? And you look at the level of support that he has in Russia, 87% support for Putin's actions. So although this is a symbolic act of repudiation by the West, my fear is that actually you're not going to get a change in Russian behavior. If anything, you're going to get a deterioration. They're not going to let themselves lose in eastern Ukraine. They'll keep supporting these separatists. Where's the way out of this?
Well, I think that Europe had to do something. I think that a red line had to be set, that this has gone too far. Effectively, what Vladimir Putin has done is he's redrawn the borders of the post-Soviet world unilaterally, and that is simply not acceptable in the international context. Secondly, he's actually pumped arms into a civil war and therefore made it much more difficult. In a way, he's dug himself a hole because he's got allies now in Ukraine who are very unreliable people and very nasty people, actually, deeply nationalist and very violent. What's going to happen if they start to lose this war? Is he going to intervene? So there's a very nasty short-term problem coming up, and sanctions are a very long-term instrument. But I simply don't think the Europeans could have just sat there and let this happen. They had to take action, and they don't want to go in militarily. So actually, thank God for sanctions, because it isn't a military intervention.
Quentin, I completely understand why the West felt it had to react, and I have no sympathy for Russian behavior in eastern Ukraine. My anxiety about this is that there's no way out, really, and I think, if anything, we may see a radicalization of Russian behavior in response to this, both But we'll see over the next year, and I suspect we'll have plenty more opportunities to discuss this. So Quentin Peel, thank you very much for joining me here in the FT studio in London.